Snow descended in an unhurried dance over a deserted industrial road, a place forsaken by all but the relentless wind. Beside a decaying chainlink fence, a mother German shepherd huddled around her two quivering pups, their breaths coming in fragile, shallow puffs. Their eyes stared into a world that seemed to have already forgotten them. In this desolate place, no one was ever supposed to be. No one, that is, except a Navy SEAL behind the wheel of a red truck. A man driving toward nothing forever, haunted by the echoes of orders that refused to fade. He wasn't looking for a path to redemption on that day, but in that moment, as his headlights pierced the swirling snow and found those desperate eyes, something deep inside him finally fractured the silence. And what unfolded next would reveal that true mercy doesn't scream for attention. It whispers on the wind, through the falling snow, through fear itself, and through the souls of men who'd forgotten how to listen. Before we go any further, tell me, where are you tuning in from? Go ahead and drop your country in the comments section below. It was the depths of late winter in Burlington, Vermont, a time when the snow no longer fell with grace, but instead seemed to press down on the world with an immense, suffocating silence. The warehouses that lined the fringe of the industrial district stood like forgotten sentinels, gray and weathered by the unforgiving wind. Their corrugated walls were scarred with streaks of rust and ice. The air carried the faint odor of cold metal and diesel, the unmistakable scent of a place that had drawn its last breath long ago. It was through this frozen maze that Noah Carter steered his red pickup, his gloved hands resting with a telling stiffness upon the steering wheel. His body was going through the motions, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, trapped somewhere beneath a foreign sun, where the whine of rotor blades and the echo of distant screams had once served as his lullaby. In his left ear, he still carried the ghost of an explosion, a detonation that had in some way never really ended. It thrummed at the base of his skull like something alive, a low metallic whine that always grew louder whenever the world around him went quiet. Noah was 38, a man with broad shoulders and lines carved into his face that told a story far older than his years. Strands of gray had begun to invade the dark, short hair at his temples, and his jaw remained perpetually shadowed by a well-kept beard. His eyes, a sharp steel blue, were clouded with a deep fatigue, betraying the turmoil of a man who had mastered the art of survival, but had forgotten how to truly live. Following 12 years as a Navy SEAL, he had returned home to Vermont, bringing with him medals nobody dared to ask about, and a heavy silence that no one knew how to break. He scraped by with odd maintenance jobs at the harbor, barely sleeping, and took long, winding detours through snow-choked streets for reasons he couldn't grasp. That afternoon, the storm was finally breaking, yet the wind still shrieked through the chain-link fences like a tormented spirit. Noah despised the grating sound of metal. It echoed with the memory of shrapnel on bone, so he cranked the truck's heater, desperate to silence it. His gaze locked on the white road carving through the desolate lots. He tried to convince himself he was just checking pipes at the old mill, but deep down he knew he was pursuing quiet, the way a drowning man fights for air. As he drove past a narrow side road, a faint metallic clinking cut through the engine's drone. He went completely still. It was quiet, yet sharp, and rhythmic, fragile, almost human in its persistence. The kind of sound you only hear when you've spent too long listening for ghosts. Noah eased the truck to a crawl, his breath clouding the windshield as he stared through the growing frost. Initially, he saw only an expanse of white. Then, by a rusted post at the fence line, a shape emerged, a dark mound half-buried something that didn't drift like the snow. He shut off the truck, killing the engine. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the wind. Then it sounded again, the soft, chilling rattle of a chain. He pushed the door open. The cold hit him like a judgment. His boots cracked over the frozen earth as he drew closer. The shape resolved into a dog, a large German shepherd, black and tan, with fur completely caked in ice. Her ribs protruded sharply beneath the matted coat. A short, cruel length of chain led from her collar to the post lost in the snow. Two smaller forms were pressed against her stomach. Puppies. One whimpered faintly, the other lay unnervingly still, its fur stiff with frost. Noah stopped short just a few feet away. The mother raised her head, her eyes guarded but too exhausted for aggression. They were a deep, haunting amber color, the kind that held both terror and a plea for forgiveness. He had seen that look before, in civilians pulled from ruins, in soldiers knowing the medevac was not coming. Her breath escaped in shallow puffs as the chain shook when she shifted to shield her pups. A knot tightened deep inside Noah. He had sworn to himself he was done with rescues, done with the primal instinct that never let him turn away. Yet here it was, that familiar ache constricting his chest, that same whisper asking, "If not you, then who?" He knelt, the ghosts of old injuries screaming in his knees as he spoke. "Easy, girl." His voice was a gravelly whisper, raw from weeks of speaking only to himself in the suffocating silence. The dog didn't move. Her ears twitched once, then went still. She was no longer afraid. She was simply broken. He reached for the chain, the biting metal frozen so solid to the post it seared right through his gloves. He pulled once, twice, then froze as the shriek of metal tore through his head like a piece of shrapnel. His breath hitched. The memory crashed in uninvited. Sand smoke and the ringing of steel after the blast that had taken his men. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing air into his lungs until the tremors passed. When he opened them, he saw her watching him, her gaze steady as if she knew his torment. "Okay," he whispered. "We are doing this together." He yanked again with all his might. The chain ripped from the ice with a crack like a gunshot. The dog flinched, but held her ground. Noah took off his jacket and wrapped it around her trembling body, then gathered her two pups. The living one squirmed feebly, a fragile pulse beating against his palm. The lifeless pup he gently placed inside the coat for leaving it behind was an unthinkable transgression. He carried them to the truck, his own breath tearing out in ragged bursts. The heater blasted on as he climbed in, filling the cab with the scent of damp fur and rust. He laid the dog across the seat next to him. The pups nestled against her, seeking whatever warmth remained. For the first time since the war, the noise in his head began to subside. It wasn't silenced, but it had finally softened, replaced by the rhythm of another's breathing, by the fragile weight of a life that still trusted him. As he sat there, a flicker of movement snagged his gaze through the fogged glass. A tiny bell dangling from the dog's ragged collar. It was cracked completely through, held by a single thread of leather. As the wind shifted, the bell chimed once faintly. It was a fractured, hollow sound, one that had no business existing in the biting cold. Noah's gaze fixed upon it, the muscles in his jaw clenching into knots. In another desert a lifetime ago, a bell exactly like this one had dangled from a soldier's pack. A knot formed in his throat, tight and suffocating. He'd long since stopped believing in signs. That faith was gone. He twisted the key, and the engine roared to life with a guttural protest. Twin beams of light sliced through the blizzard, revealing the road ahead, endless, vacant, and blindingly white. For a heartbeat, he remained frozen, his hand suspended over the gear shift. The chain on the post struck again, a lonely clang carried on the wind, a faint echo that haunted the desolate lot. He saw the mother dog's reflection in the glass, her face a mask of exhaustion and scars, but she was still alive. He knew the feeling all too well. Noah let out a slow breath, a white plume that clouded the frigid air, and then whispered, "Let's go home." He slid the truck into gear, the tires grinding against the ice. As they rolled forward, the ghostly chime of the broken bell seemed to chase them, weaving with the hum in his ears. Two phantoms becoming a single haunting sound. Miles and miles away, in a quiet house at the end of Maple Street, an old woman named Eleanor Reeves lit a single candle beneath a framed photograph of a young man in his uniform. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the wick. The picture showed her son, Lieutenant Mark Reeves, his smile bathed in the harsh light of a desert sun. He had died 10 years earlier, somewhere far away, following orders that offered no comfort when the official letter finally arrived. Eleanor was 72 now, a slight woman, her silver hair coiled in a loose bun. Her expression held the profound stillness of a soul that has waited too long for answers that would never come. Beyond her window, the old church bell began to toll 6 times. She watched the candle's flame dance with each chime, whispering to the photograph, "If you're still out there, son, find your way home." The small light trembled as if in response. For a moment it seemed as though another fainter bell answered from deep within the storm. The morning that followed arrived drained of all color. The sky was an oppressive sheet of gray, hanging low over Burlington like a tired, heavy hand. Snow continued its descent, light yet relentless, blanketing the tracks from the day before, pretending nothing had ever happened. Noah Carter stood alone in his small kitchen, the space lit only by the soft blue glow of the gas stove. Outside, his red truck was idling a thin wisp of smoke, rising from its exhaust. On the floor by the door, a blanket shifted a mound of 3 desperate forms. A mother dog was curled around her 2 tiny pups, one lifeless, and the other barely breathing. Noah slowly crouched, his knees protesting as he reached for the blanket's edge. The mother's eyes shot open, exhausted but watchful. They were a deep amber, rimmed with exhaustion. But something in that gaze held him. Not fear, it was a silent waiting. Noah recalled the chain, the bite of frozen steel in his palms. The dream of it had haunted him through the long night, its clinking sound melting into the relentless ringing inside his head. He'd given them his own soaked jacket before the drive home, but sleep offered no escape. Every time the mother moved, the small bell on her neck would softly ring, a fractured chime that echoed from a place buried deep within his memory. He stood and moved to the kettle. As steam hissed, his own reflection haunted him from the dark glass of the window. Unshaven, hollow-eyed, the face of a man aged beyond his years by scars he was too young to carry. He poured warmed milk into a bowl, a faint stir from the pup. The mother's ears flickered and she gently pushed her one surviving baby toward the warmth, urging it to drink. Her motions were measured and slow, possessing a grace born only from enduring agony. Noah knelt again, murmuring low, "You're safe here." He spoke the words, so strange upon his lips. Months had passed since he'd spoken to anyone but the voices in his own mind. He reached for the collar to finally silence that broken bell. A faint scrape of metal on metal, and in that split second his world shattered. The blast roared back. Searing heat, choking sand, shouts turning to static. The same sharp ringing screamed through his skull. He gripped the counter until the memory passed. When the noise finally dimmed, the mother dog was just staring at him again, still and silent as if she'd somehow seen the war that was behind his eyes. By noon, a small fire burned in the stove as he dried their damp fur with a worn towel. The smaller puppet's breathing, just a whisper, didn't survive. Noah buried it behind the cabin beneath a spruce tree heavy with fresh snow. Prayer was a language he'd long forgotten, a casualty of his time in Afghanistan. Still, he remained there for a long moment before finally rising to his feet, the soft fur of the lost pup, a ghostly trace on his gloves. The mother watched him from the window, her gaze not one of accusation, but of somber acceptance. It was that silent stillness that shattered him in a way no sound ever could. When he stepped back inside, her head lifted almost imperceptibly. He saw the frost clinging to her fur, the stark outline of ribs beneath her worn coat, the broken half-bell resting against her throat. "You deserve a name," he spoke into the quiet. "Something that holds the light." He considered for a moment, his eyes tracing the pale gray sky beyond the glass. "Luna," he whispered the name, feeling as fragile as new-fallen snow, as if it could vanish if spoken too loudly. At her belly, the surviving pup squirmed, a tiny flicker of life in the profound hush. "And you," he murmured to it. "I'll call you Milo." As Luna shifted, the broken bell swung, making not a chime, but a single hollow tap. But Noah heard it a sound soft, and distant, like an echo ringing through the corridors of his memory. He sat with them on the cold floor for a very long time, his hand resting near her paw, not touching, but close enough to share his warmth. Across town in a little wooden house near the old church, Eleanor Reeves sat listening to her radio. The deep snow outside had swallowed every sound, leaving only the relentless ticking of the clock on her wall. She was bundled in a thick, brown cardigan over a simple blue dress. Her white hair neatly tied, her hands thin and marked by time, wrapped around a ceramic mug of tea. The broadcaster's voice crackled through the speaker. "A local report. A former Navy SEAL has been sighted near the Burlington docks, reportedly keeping to himself. Sources say he occasionally helps at the animal shelter." Eleanor froze mid-sip. The words struck a forgotten chord deep inside her, a connection she hadn't considered in years. A SEAL in Burlington. She leaned closer, her breath held tight, her heart fluttering with a dangerous mixture of fear and impossible hope. Her son Mark had served in a SEAL unit in the Gulf just before he was killed in action. The young soldier who had written to thank her for the care packages, his handwriting so careful and humble, had signed his name Carter. She kept that very letter folded carefully inside her prayer book. Her vision blurred as she whispered, "Could it truly be him?" With aching knees, she rose from her chair, a slow, deliberate movement, and drifted toward the window. Outside, the church bell swayed a dark shape against the falling snow. Its mournful chime was a faint, hollow ghost in the storm. Her fingers trembling brushed against the small silver bell that hung beside the photograph of her son. The very same one she had clutched since the day of his funeral. The hairline crack along its rim had spiderwebbed deeper with time, but it still managed to capture the dim light in precisely the same way. "If you ever find someone who truly needs it," she murmured to his memory, "let this sound be the one that leads them home." Back in the isolated cabin, Noah sat with Luna and Milo lost in the fire's warmth. The heat had soothed the raw edges of the day, but a bone-deep exhaustion still shadowed his eyes. He traced the fractured bell with his thumb. It was ancient, its silver tarnished by harsh seasons, its leather strap weathered and frayed. He couldn't help but wonder who had fastened it there. Who was the person that left her chained in the heart of the snow? There was a story locked in that silence, and he could feel it pressing in as heavy as his own past. He poured a cup of coffee, dark and unforgiving, and leaned his weight back against the wall. The low, constant hum in his ears was finally starting to fade. Milo let out a tiny yawn, stretching one small, perfect paw across Luna's weary side. She acknowledged him with a brief lift of her head, then rested it against her pup, her own eyes slowly drifting half-closed. Noah watched them in the flickering firelight, struck by the thought that survival looked nothing like the strength he'd once known. It looked more like a quiet act of surrender that simply refused to die. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to break. Through the small window, the world was transforming, painted faintly gold with the very first touch of dusk. Noah walked to the door and stared out at the endless expanse of white. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, he thought he could see shapes moving far beyond the distant fence line. Men, smoke, the searing heat of a desert sun. But the vision vanished as quickly as it had formed. He retreated to the table, reaching for his worn field jacket, and from an inner pocket pulled out a creased photograph. A group of men in uniform smiling into the glare of another world. One of them, a young man with impossibly kind eyes, had scrawled a message on the back. "For Carter, keep the light, even when it burns." The ink was bled and faded from years of sweat and weather. Noah stared at it until his own vision blurred. Then he looked over at Luna, and with a voice heavy with memory, he spoke to her softly. He killed the engine and plunged the cab into darkness, but as he restarted it to head for supplies, a faint metallic tremor came from the bell on Luna's collar. He went rigid. The sound was a whisper, but in his mind it roared like thunder. A memory detonating the desert, erupting in a blinding flash of white sand and smoke. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hand strangling the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. When he forced his eyes open, the road before him had dissolved from asphalt into ash. The swirling snow warped, reshaping itself into the ghost of a battlefield. He breathed through the vision slowly, forcing the phantom images to retreat. Outside, the wind whispered the faintest echo of that bell, and for a single, terrifying heartbeat, he couldn't distinguish if the sound came from the dog or from a place buried deep within his soul. By morning, the storm had surrendered. It left behind a delicate, crystalline light that shimmered across the surface of the frozen lake. Noah Carter stood at his cabin window, his gaze lost on the bleak gray line where the sky bled into the ice. His own faint reflection stared back from the glass, a specter, with broad shoulders and weathered hands, and the vacant eyes of a man still debating if he had any place left in this world. Behind him, the crackle of the wood stove was a steady heartbeat in the profound silence of the room. On the rug by the fire, the German Shepherd was curled protectively, her one surviving pup nestled safely against her belly. He had buried the other one before the sun rose. Noah's hands were raw from the frozen earth, a pain he welcomed. The ache was real, a grounding force that proved he wasn't numb. He poured warm milk into a chipped bowl, placing it gently before the new mother. "You earned this," he whispered, his voice rough. The dog managed to lift her head, her eyes clouded with an ocean of exhaustion, but they remained watchful. Her coat, once a sheet of dark silk, was now thawed into soft tufts that carried the faint scent of iron and ice. The tiny pup stirred a fragile whimper, escaping its muzzle as it blindly sought its mother's warmth. The mother's ears flickered at the sound. She nudged the bowl with her nose, but wouldn't drink, as if waiting for him to move or for the crushing silence to finally break. With protesting knees, Noah slowly lowered himself to the floor beside her. "You deserve a name," he murmured. "Something to prove you're more than just what was left behind." His fingers brushed the shattered bell that dangled from her collar. The metal was split a clean break straight through its heart. It caught the firelight from the stove, casting it back in fractured, uneven slivers. "Luna." He finally whispered the word, hanging heavy in the air as he tested its weight. The dog blinked once, a slow, silent acceptance. "And you, little one," he added, his gaze softening on the pup. "You'll be Milo." The bell moved with Luna's breath, a faint broken chime, almost silent, but to Noah it beat like a fragile pulse. By noon, the snow outside had yielded, and the sky turned a cold, unforgiving steel. Noah forced his feet into his boots and hauled an old shovel into the cold. The air bit sharp against his face, but the crushing silence felt far worse. He found the small, snow-covered mound where the second pup lay, and gently smoothed it with his gloved hand. He offered no prayer, spoke no words. Instead, he placed the other half of the broken bell, the piece from the yard atop the snow. It gave a faint gleam in the pale light, a small, imperfect headstone. A voice cut through the stillness, not carried on the wind, but clawing its way from memory. "Don't you leave them behind." It was Lieutenant Hale's command, echoing across a field of dust from another life. He squeezed his eyes shut, jaw clenched, banishing the memory as he marched back to the cabin. Inside, Luna had shifted closer to the fire, her pup tucked tightly against her flank. For the first time, she'd eaten the food he put down. Noah sank into the old armchair across from them, his hand instinctively reaching for his worn field notebook, the one he hadn't touched since his discharge. Its cover was creased and irrevocably stained with desert sand. He flipped through pages of terse script coordinates and terse notes on long-finished operations, lists of men who never returned. Then near the back, a single line in an unfamiliar hand for Carter. "Keep the light even when it burns." He ran a thumb across the ink until the words bled into a blur. "I tried," he whispered. The incessant hum in his ears, a ghost from the blast, rose and fell with the flickering of the flames. Across the vast expanse of the lake, the town slowly began to stir. Eleanor Reeves fastened her wool coat and stepped into the biting cold. Her small house slanted its roof, groaning under the weight of snow. She moved deliberately down the path to the frozen shoreline, her boots whispering in the snow. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and pine. The night before, she had dreamt of her son, a solitary figure in a field of white. He was waving, but there was no sound. Upon waking, the vision clung to her, a pull so strong she was forced to go outside. Eleanor stood small, her spine having curved beneath the weight of her years. But a quiet dignity radiated from her very presence. Her skin pale and lined like ancient parchment, contrasted with eyes that, though clouded by age, still held a serene light. Reaching the water's edge, she stopped and drew a small silver bell from deep within her coat pocket. It was the bell from beside her son's photograph. The silver surface was fractured, and yet when she tilted it, a fragile chime cut through the frigid air. The delicate sound drifted out over the lake, answered by the faintest echo from the distant shore. A smile broke through the pain in her chest. Her whisper was barely audible. "If you can hear me, I'm still here." And across the vast frozen lake, Noah felt a vibration so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. He lifted his gaze from his chair, looking toward the window. Luna had also lifted her head, her ears swiveling toward the unseen source. Outside, the wind scoured the surface of the ice, carrying a fine shimmer of snow with it. In that fleeting moment, a tension inside Noah subsided, replaced by a sense that the world was still connected, however fragilely. As twilight began to descend, he took his shovel and walked along the frozen edge of the shore, searching for some kind of steady ground. The reason escaped him. Maybe habit, maybe penance. The air was biting so cold each breath hung visibly before him. He traced the faint path leading down to the birch grove at his property line, and there he stopped and sank to his knees. On her own side of the lake, Eleanor also paused. Then, through the vapor rising from the snow, she saw the shape of a man kneeling. He was a tall, broad figure, his shoulders heavy under a green coat. Beside him stood a dark-furred dog, and a small pup staggering in the snow. His face was obscured, only his head bowed deeply, as if he were in prayer. Something in his posture stirred a memory, the same tilt of a soldier at rest, the same profound quiet that always followed loss. She yearned to call out to ask if he was all right, but an unseen force held her back. Instead, she placed her gloved hand over the small bell in her pocket, feeling its warmth against her palm. Closing her eyes, she whispered, "Perhaps you found him for me." The wind snatched her words away before she could continue. Noah stayed by the tiny grave motionless until the cold started to bite at him again. He pressed his gloved hand into the snow, smoothing the mound a final time. Then he rose, brushing the frost from his knees, and turned toward home, never sensing the eyes that watched him from across the lake. When he reached the porch, Luna trailed close, her breath a ghost in the air. The pup stumbled after her, clumsy on the slick ice. As Noah pushed the door open, the bell on Luna's collar chimed softly. 2 uneven notes, clear yet faint. And for the very first time, that sound brought no pain. It felt warm, almost human. He paused in the doorway, listening, his gaze lost to the distance. Somewhere within that faint ringing, he could have sworn he heard a voice. Not the sharp echo of a command, but something softer. Forgiveness, whispered on the snow. The chaos in his mind quieted, just for a moment, enough for him to finally breathe. The morning sky was fragile and pale, casting a light that seemed to rise not from the sun, but from the luminous snow itself. Noah Carter pulled his scarf tighter and stepped out of his truck. The crunch of his boots shattered the profound stillness outside the veterinary clinic on the outskirts of Burlington. A hand-painted sign read, "Maple Ridge Animal Care," its red paint flaking from years of relentless wind and weather. He hesitated a moment before opening the glass door, his gaze dropping to Luna and her pup Milo. The German Shepherd's coat now held a faint gleam, its stiffness from the frost gone. The small pup followed close behind. The puppy's paws, far too big for its small body, faltered in the icy slush, yet both dogs moved with the solemn grace of those who had survived. Within the clinic's walls, the air was a strange yet hopeful mix of sharp, antiseptic and earthy hay. A small heater hummed a quiet promise from the corner, breathing out an air thick with the warmth of life and healing. Behind the worn counter stood a woman in her late 40s, Dr. Sarah Collins, the sole guardian of the town's animal souls. She was tall and slender, her sandy blonde hair woven into a loose braid that rested softly against the collar of her denim shirt. Her skin was dusted with light freckles, and her mouth was framed by fine lines etched by a life of both profound joy and deep weariness. Years before, she had served as a field vet in the chaos of hurricane rescue missions, a crucible that had taught her to speak with a calming softness, but act with unhesitating speed. Her eyes lifted from a clipboard the moment Noah entered. "You must be Carter. Rick down at the dock said you'd found some strays." Her voice was a steady, calm current, the kind of sound that could quiet a storm in a frightened heart. "Yeah," Noah answered, the friction of his hands rubbing together a desperate attempt at warmth. "Mother and one pup left. They need to be checked. She's dangerously underweight, and the pup is small." Sarah knelt, extending a gentle hand toward Luna. The dog's body went rigid with fear, yet no sound of aggression escaped her. "You've earned her trust." She whispered, her gaze lifting to meet Noah's. "That's no small thing, not after trauma." Her eyes lingered on him, taking in his guarded posture and the faded military jacket. She saw that haunted, faraway look of a man who carried the ghosts of what he'd seen, but she refrained from asking. She knew not to probe at wounds that were still raw. She guided them into a back room where sterile metal tables shone unnervingly under the glare of harsh white lights. As Noah gently hoisted Luna onto the cold steel, the fractured silent bell on her collar caught the light, a tiny broken memory. Sarah's eyes caught the detail, but she held her tongue, focusing instead on the dog's temperature, her pulse, the light in her eyes. "She is so lucky," she said. "Oh, lucky. A few more hours in that brutal cold and her story would have ended. This little guy, though he's a fighter, he's got your stubborn jawline." A ghost of a smile touched Noah's lips, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "He's named Milo. She's Luna." "Beautiful names," Sarah murmured, her pen scratching against the paper. "Are you planning on giving them a home? I haven't decided yet," he replied. But the lie was betrayed by a truth that had already settled deep in his voice. Just as Sarah turned to grab a syringe of vitamins, a faint metallic chime broke the silence, the sound delicate yet sharp. It echoed softly against the cold tiled walls. Out in the reception area where volunteers sorted donated blankets and food, an elderly woman stopped dead, her hands frozen in mid-air. Eleanor Reeves stood by the counter clutching a box marked "Community Donation in Memory of Mark Reeves." Her gloved hands began to tremble. That fragile sound had pierced the air, lodging itself somewhere deep within her heart. For one fleeting second, she believed her mind was deceiving her again, the way grief so cruelly does, replaying the echoes of everything she had lost. But then her eyes locked onto it. A man in a faded green jacket stood beside a German shepherd, and from its neck hung a familiar, half-broken silver bell. Her throat constricted. She took one hesitant step forward. Sarah returned just as Eleanor was approaching the doorway. "Sarah," Eleanor began, her voice a fragile whisper, hoarse from a lifetime of harsh winters and unshed tears. "That bell!" Her hand trembling pointed directly at Luna. "Where did you get that?" Noah's head snapped up, his body instantly adopting the rigid stillness of a soldier sensing danger before it arrives. "I found her chained up outside the old mill," he answered cautiously, his tone guarded. "She was wearing it when I got there." Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears. "That bell," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "I used to send them overseas years ago when my son was stationed with the Ivy unit. I would tie them onto little care packages, tiny silver bells, each with a prayer etched into the inner rim." She reached for her scarf, pulling it down as if struggling to breathe. "One of those packages went to a Navy SEAL Team Ivy division. My Mark, he wrote to me about it once. He said a soldier named Carter received the extra bell by mistake." Noah froze solid. The entire world around him dissolved, leaving only the faint ticking of a clock and the thunderous rush of blood in his ears. The memory hit him like a tidal wave. He remembered that bell now, the small token tied to a ration box sent by a mother who never stopped hoping. And he remembered the letter that came later, the one stamped with the final heartbreaking words, "Deceased in action." For months he had treasured that bell, a relic from a life before the blast turned everything to ash. Ivy Division. He whispered the name, a ghost on his lips. That was my unit. The words hung in the air. Sarah's eyes darted between them, her hand slowly lowering the syringe. She knew this was a moment too profound to interrupt, and silently retreated. Eleanor, however, drew nearer, her gaze locked on the fractured bell. So it found its way home after all. She breathed, her voice a fragile tremor caught somewhere between awe and a deep, aching sorrow. Carried here by the hands of a stranger and a creature with no voice of its own. She mused, a faint, bittersweet smile touching her lips as her eyes glistened. My mark. He believed every sound holds a memory. Perhaps this one carried his. Noah swallowed against a knot in his throat, torn between speaking and bowing his head. Your son. He began, the words catching. He was our medic, Mark Reeves. His voice cracked, the name trailing off into the heavy silence. But she was already nodding, an understanding in her eyes that pierced him. I know, she said gently. He saved more men than history will ever remember. But then the letters stopped coming, and the war consumed everything else. The room suddenly felt suffocating, crowded with ghosts. Luna tilted her head, her intelligent eyes shifting between the two humans, as if she could feel a reunion of souls beyond her comprehension. The pup squirmed in Noah's embrace, agitated by the heavy stillness. Ella Laner's gaze settled on the man standing before her. She saw the rigid shoulders, the haunted eyes, and recognized the very same shadow that clung to her son in his last photograph. You were there with him, weren't you? She asked, the question hanging in the charged air. Yes, Noah replied. I was there when it ended. His voice shattered. He made sure the others got out. Noah confessed, his next words a choked whisper. I didn't. She reached for him, her weathered hand trembling as it rested on his arm. Then you did get out, she insisted with a simple, powerful certainty. You carried a piece of him here. That's all a mother can pray for, even if she doesn't get to see it. Her words hung in the space between them, a fragile warmth pushing back against the chill of their shared past. Sarah slipped back into the room, draping a blanket over Luna, while murmuring something about recovery schedules and rest. But neither Noah nor Ella Laner heard a single word. The very air between them seemed to hum with a silent, powerful recognition. It was the unspoken understanding of two people forever bound by a war they never chose, each a survivor of a different battlefield. Outside, the snow began to fall once more, light whispering flakes dancing on the wind. Noah stood at the threshold of the open door, watching it fall, while Eleanor stayed inside, her hand resting gently on Luna's head. The bell chimed just once, a fragile sound that felt as if it belonged only to them. No more words were exchanged, none were needed, and between them stood the dog, and in the space between her quiet breaths and the echo of that broken bell, something shifted. A wordless greeting from a time long past. Or maybe it was a silent goodbye. Then the wind swept the sound into nothingness. The days started to lengthen as winter's icy grip on Burlington finally began to fail. Snow still stubbornly clung to the edges of the roads, but sunlight was now spilling through the gray, glinting off the surfaces of puddles and sharp icicles. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Noah Carter woke before the dawn, not driven by habit or haunted by nightmares, but by the soft whine of a dog needing to be let outside. Luna waited patiently by the cabin door, her fur catching the pale gold of the morning. Milo stumbled along behind her, his paws still clumsy in the frost, his tail wagging with the hesitant rhythm of a brand new life. The air outside was sharp enough to sting, but Noah found he didn't mind. He just watched them run, Luna trotting ahead, the pup bounding after, and for one fleeting moment he felt a sensation like peace, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to trust for so very long. Noah had started spending his days at the rescue center ever since Sarah Collins, the town veterinarian, offered him a volunteer spot. "You have a way with animals," she had told him. "Not many people understand silence the way that you do." And it was true. He never trained the dogs with commands, but with a profound stillness. His every movement was quiet and deliberate. When a terrified dog cowered, he offered no coaxing words. He simply sat beside it until the trembling finally stopped. The other volunteers would often watch him with a quiet curiosity, wondering how a man of so few words could soothe creatures born from fear. The rescue center was just a converted warehouse tucked away right behind the clinic, its walls a patchwork of mismatched wood and corrugated tin. Inside, the earthy scent of hay mingled with the sharp smell of disinfectant. Sarah worked grueling hours there, her single braid growing just a little more disheveled with each passing day. Her sleeves were always rolled up as she stitched wounds, cleaned and fed. She was the type of woman whose exhaustion never once touched her voice, but in the quiet sag of her shoulders when she believed no one was watching. Noah began staying late just to help her lock the doors. Their conversations were few, but they were devastatingly honest. She never again asked about Afghanistan, and he never asked why her phone was always turned face down on the counter. Some wounds they silently agreed didn't require a name to be understood. Luna and Milo slowly became the heart of the shelter. The mother dog, though deeply cautious at first, gradually began to trust the people who brought her warmth and food. She would rest near Noah's feet during his lunch breaks, her head a gentle weight against his boot, her eyes half closed in quiet peace. Milo grew braver with every sunrise, his black and tan coat now shining with health, his ears alert, and his tail a constant, hopeful blur. He loved to attack the mop when Sarah cleaned, turning the most boring chore into a small, magnificent, and ridiculous war. Sometimes Noah would feel a smile spread across his face, a real one, and it was like rediscovering a language he was sure he had forgotten. Then came an evening when the sky deepened to indigo, and the last light bled out across the surface of the lake. Eleanor Reeves arrived at the shelter. She moved with a deliberate, careful grace, her old wool coat buttoned to her chin against the cold. Her silver hair seemed to capture the lamplight. Sarah offered her a kind, knowing nod. Eleanor was known for her donations of supplies, but this evening she carried something else entirely in her hand, a small wooden box. "Noah?" she called softly. Her voice was calm, but a tremor of emotion ran just beneath the surface. He turned from where he was wiping down the kennel doors. "Evening, ma'am." "I've brought something for you," she said, stepping closer. She placed the box on the table between them. "I believe this belongs with you." Noah hesitated, a strange feeling rising in his chest, then opened it. Inside lay a small silver bell split cleanly down the middle. Its edges were worn smooth by years. The fracture was a near-perfect mirror of the one on Luna's collar. His breath caught in his throat. "This," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "was the other half." She revealed the matching piece she had kept safe. The two fragments, though dulled and battered by years and distance, came together and fit perfectly as one. "It was hanging from my son's pack," she uttered, her voice heavy. "It came back with the rest of his belongings. I always believed it was just another memento, but now, after meeting you..." Her words faded, her eyes glistening, yet holding firm. "I believe it was always destined to be whole again." Noah gazed down at the fractured pieces in his palm, seeing his own reflection twisted in the broken metal. His image was as shattered as the memories that haunted him from the war. The grit, the suffocating heat, the cries for help lost in the ringing of his own ears. "He saved my life," Noah confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Your son? I've never told a soul." "An explosion went off near our convoy. He pulled me free just moments before the second blast hit. I was pinned beneath the wreckage. 17 hours passed before they found me. I was sure I was gone." Eleanor shut her eyes tightly, her lips trembling with unspoken words. But nothing came out. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile thread of sound no louder than the heater's hum. 17 hours, she echoed softly. He would have stayed with you, too. She reached forward, her hand gently closing over the two halves of the bell in Noah's palm. Her fingers shook slightly as she brought the jagged edges together. The fractures aligned perfectly, seamlessly, one scar recognizing its other half. The bell produced a faint, muted tone, a sound felt deep in their chests rather than heard with their ears. In the doorway, Sarah froze, a silent witness to the impossible sound. Luna's head snapped up, her ears twitching. Even Milo ceased his play, sitting utterly still. There, Eleanor breathed. Some things can't make a sound on their own. They need a shared wound to ring true. Noah was speechless. He simply stared at the reunited bell, feeling its impossible weight in his hand. The chime wasn't the sharp clang of metal on stone, but a gentle resonance, like a memory softened by the passage of time. And for the first time, that sound didn't echo the blast. It reminded him of a heartbeat, a breath, of something that was still alive. Sarah moved into the room quietly. You have to keep it, she urged softly. It belongs to you now. But Eleanor shook her head. No, it belongs to them. Her gaze drifted toward Luna and the puppy. The ones who carried it home. Outside, a gentle snow began to fall once more, each flake catching the warm glow of the lamplight. Noah moved toward the doorway, the small bell cradled in his palm. Luna trailed closely behind, pressing her warm muzzle to his leg, her amber eyes glowing in the twilight. He knelt carefully, fastening the mended bell back onto her collar. It chimed a single gentle note, full and resonant, like the lingering whisper of something sacred. When he rose, he met Eleanor's gaze. She offered a small, weary smile. It's a strange thing, she murmured. How an object that was broken can sound more true than it ever did when it was whole. Noah gave a slow nod. Maybe that's how it finally learns its true song. The three of them remained there in a shared silence, the elder, the soldier, and the animals that had woven their separate lives together, suspended somewhere between the descending snow and the day's last light. The chime of the bell lingered not as an echo of pain, but as a solemn promise. That evening when Noah was home, he placed the bell upon the windowsill beside a flickering candle. As a gust of wind swept past the cabin, it sang out faintly. For the first time since the war, he didn't recoil at the sound. He smiled, a quiet, profound expression, like a man truly hearing life for the very first time. The day dawned with a tense quiet, the kind of charged silence that hangs in the air right before something shatters. By the afternoon, the sky above Lake Champlain had deepened to a bruised, threatening gray. The atmosphere felt thick and heavy, pressing down upon the town like a breath being held too long. At the rescue center, Noah Carter stacked crates against the rear wall, the low rumble of the wind a mournful echo in the rafters. Luna and Milo lay curled up near the heater, the pup's head tucked securely against his mother's warm flank. Every few moments, the older dog would lift her head, her ears swiveling toward the window, as if she could already feel the storm gathering its strength. Dr. Sarah Collins came in from the back, her dark braid glistening with freezing rain. They're saying it'll get much worse by nightfall, she announced, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. The power lines are already down in the south end. We must transport the animals inland before the roads become impassable. Her voice was sharp with urgency, but her eyes held a deeper shadow of concern. She had witnessed storms like this before, the kind that could steal all sound from the world and leave nothing but an endless white. Noah simply nodded. He had survived far worse, though this was a different beast entirely. In Afghanistan, storms raged with sand and fire. Here, they came with a silent ice that cut deeper still. He glanced at the dogs. I'll take the van, get them to the church shelter before nightfall. Sarah hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Are you sure the visibility is disappearing by the second? He offered a faint smile. "Ma'am, I've navigated through far worse than a snowstorm." By dusk, the wind had escalated into a piercing shriek. Blinding sheets of snow tore sideways across the lot, while Noah wrestled the final crate into the security of the van. Inside, the animals cried out in their carriers, their soft whimpers all but swallowed by the gale's deafening roar. He spun back toward the shelter's doorway to call for Luna and Milo, only to find the space chillingly, utterly empty. The blanket they had been nestled on was a crumpled heap, a desperate trail of paw prints leading to the unlatched gate. His heart froze in his chest. Without a second thought, he snatched his coat, yanked the hood tight, and plunged directly into the storm's fury. The cold struck him like a physical blow, sharp, blinding, and absolute. Snow lashed violently against his face, each crystal stinging like salt poured into an open wound. He screamed their names, but the wind stole the words from his lips. Luna was trained to stay by his side, but terror overrides all training. She must have bolted when thunder shattered the air over the lake. His hand dove into his pocket, his fingers closing around the bell the mended halves Ella had given back to him. The metal was ice against his palm. He raised it, his hand trembling as he shook it. The chime was a faint, nearly imagined whisper against the storm, but in that endless white expanse, it felt like a signal, a fragile tether to something living. He pushed forward, his head bowed, chasing the ghost-like impressions of paw prints in the snow. They veered erratically toward the lake. His world shrank to disjointed flashes of movement. The menacing curve of a tree trunk, a sudden glint of ice, the ragged sound of his own breath tearing through the frozen air. Then, as he broke through to the shoreline, he saw them. Luna was crouched low by the lip of a half-frozen inlet, her small body taut and trembling. She was clawing desperately at something in the dark water. Noah plunged forward, the deep snow swallowing his legs up to his knees. And then he saw him, Milo, a dark form struggling feebly in a jagged hole in the ice. "No!" The cry ripped from his very soul. Without thinking, he hit the ice, sliding uncontrollably toward them. Luna's claws scrabbled desperately at the little pup's scruff, but her strength was giving out. Noah lunged forward, snatching her collar in one hand and Milo's small form in the other. With a terrifying crack, the ice shattered beneath him. The lake consumed him entirely. The shock was paralyzing, a silence that screamed louder than any noise. The cold pierced every nerve, his chest seized in an iron grip. For a moment, he was utterly disoriented, lost in the dark. Then raw instinct ignited. He kicked, shoving the puppy upward, breaking the surface in a desperate gasp for air. Luna's bark was a frantic, terrified sound as she heaved her weight backward, helping to drag them toward the safety of the edge. He hauled with every last bit of strength, his muscles screaming in protest, until they finally collapsed together onto the snow. Luna lay beside him, her chest rising and falling, violently wet fur plastered to her ribs. Milo whimpered quietly, nestled safely between them. Noah clutched the puppy to his chest, shielding it from the wind with his own body. His numb fingers fumbled in his pocket for the bell. It was gone. The chain had snapped. He fell back onto the snow, his gaze lost in the endless black sky. Icy flakes stinging his face. Out on that frozen expanse, he thought he heard the faintest, ghostly metallic echo, the bell sinking into the depths. The sound faded, growing quieter, deeper, until it was gone forever. Miles away in her little house on the hill, Elena Reeves watched through her window as the storm consumed the world. She caught the distant, hazy flicker of Noah's headlights before they vanished behind the trees. Moments later, the power failed, plunging her home into an unnerving darkness. She stood in the profound silence for a moment, then lit a single candle. Its fragile flame danced in the draft. She lifted the silver bell, the smaller one, the one that had hung by her son's photograph for so many years. Her fingers traced the engraved plea for a safe return. She closed her eyes, her lips. "Guide him home, just as you did for my boy." Then she braced herself and stepped into the gale. The wind struck her like a physical blow, almost extinguishing the fragile flame. but she desperately shielded it with cupped hands. Every single step toward the lake felt agonizingly heavy, the snow consuming her ankles. "Keep him," she pleaded to the empty air, her voice fracturing. "Keep him for me." She raised the bell and allowed it to ring just once. The sound was thin, almost brittle, but it journeyed through the wind across the white and into that space where fear confronts faith. Back by the shore, Noah heard it, or maybe he only imagined that he did. A faint chime was drifting somewhere between the storm's howl and the thunder of his own heart. He didn't know if it was real or if his mind had conjured it from a memory, but it gave him just enough strength to move. He pushed himself to his feet, cradling Milo close. He called softly to Luna. She stirred, licking his face with a weak, trembling tongue. "Come on," he whispered into her fur. "We're almost there." The snow was a blinding white haze, but through it he could discern the faint glow of a lantern near the tree line. Elalena's silhouette was waiting there, the candlelight flickering precariously in her hands. He tried to call her name, but his voice came out only as a cloud of vapor. Then darkness began to bleed in from the edges of his vision. He felt Luna's fur brush his arm, the precious weight of the pup against his chest, the phantom warmth of breath on his neck. And somewhere deep beneath that, far below the ice, a bell chimed once soft and impossibly distant, and then final. The world faded away into white. It returned to him slowly through a dull, throbbing pain and the sterile scent of antiseptic. Noah Carter's eyes trembled open to a ceiling that was the color of a dense fog. There were white walls, the steady drone of a heater, and a single sharp line of light cutting across the floor. He blinked several times before the realization dawned the silence wasn't in the room, it was inside of him. He tried to lift his head, but a crushing wave of dizziness pinned him back down. The faintest vibration pulsed in his ears, like distant thunder rumbling behind a thick wall of glass. He managed to turn his head slightly, and then he saw them. Luna and Milo curled up together on the blanket at the foot of his bed. Luna's fur had dried into gentle waves brushed clean and smelling faintly of soap. Milo, so small against her, was tucked safely against her chest. His tiny paw twitched, lost in a dream. For a long, silent while, Noah simply watched them breathe. The rhythm became his anchor. Each rise and fall of their chests was a quiet reassurance, reminding him that they were still here, and that somehow he was too. As the nurse came in, her lips formed words that never found him, a silent movie playing before his eyes. Her face was soft and kind, her hair coiled into a neat bun. She pointed to a small device attached to the headboard, her mouth shaping the words, "Hearing damage, it's temporary." Noah gave a slow, deliberate nod. He understood just enough. The blast in Afghanistan had stolen his hearing for weeks once before.